The Galactic Survival Certification Board had, over the course of 17,000 standard cycles, perfected the art of making simple things unnecessarily complicated. What began as a reasonable requirement, prove you won't immediately die if stranded on a habitable planet, had evolved into a baroque nightmare of regulations, subcommittees, and certification levels that would make any self-respecting bureaucrat weep with joy. The GSCB operated under a singular, unshakable philosophy. Survival was a technical problem, requiring technical solutions. Their headquarters orbited a pleasant Class M world that had never experienced anything more threatening than a light drizzle, which perhaps explained their fundamental misunderstanding of what actual survival entailed. The board consisted of species who had conquered their respective homeworlds so thoroughly that the concept of roughing it meant staying in a hotel with only 4-star accommodations instead of 5. To earn a primitive world survival certification, mandatory for anyone wishing to explore uncharted territories or work in frontier installations, candidates had to demonstrate proficiency in deploying emergency shelters, activating distress beacons, rationing nutrient packs, and waiting patiently for rescue. The test took place on a carefully curated planet where the most dangerous predator was a rabbit-like creature that the board's xenobiologists had specifically bred to be non-threatening. Even the weather was controlled by orbital satellites to ensure nothing genuinely uncomfortable occurred. Most species approached the test with appropriate gravitas. The Kalari, with their 4 arms and crystalline thought matrices, would construct elaborate shelter systems and establish perimeter sensors within the first hour. The Vosh, being essentially intelligent plants, would find a sunny spot and enter a meditative state while their nutrient reserves sustained them. The Drexel would form democratic committees to debate the most efficient use of their supply packs, usually spending so much time voting on procedures that the test ended before they reached any actual decisions. The success rate hovered around 97%. Failures typically involve someone accidentally triggering their emergency beacon too early, or, in one memorable case, a Vosh who chose a spot that became shaded and panicked. The board considered this an acceptable outcome. After all, the test wasn't meant to be difficult, it was meant to be passable, which was an entirely different thing. Nobody had ever actually needed to find food. The nutrient packs provided were calculated to sustain each species for exactly the test's duration, plus a 15% safety margin. Water sources were clearly marked on the standard-issue data pads. The entire exercise was essentially camping with training wheels, and everyone knew it, which made the board's decision to confiscate all food supplies this particular cycle either brilliantly innovative or catastrophically stupid, depending on whom you asked. The decision had come from Judge Kelrath, a Zentari whose species had eliminated hunger 4,000 years ago through a combination of photosynthesis enhancement and the ability to absorb ambient radiation. Kelrath had recently attended a symposium on advancing standards in survival certification and returned with dangerous ideas about authenticity. If they were testing survival skills, Kelrath argued, shouldn't candidates actually have to, survive? The other judges had been skeptical. Judge Morvan, whose species consumed liquid minerals, pointed out that their entire testing framework assumed adequate nutrition. Judge Telox, who didn't technically eat at all but absorbed energy directly from electromagnetic fields, worried about liability. But Kelrath had been persuasive and, more importantly, had secured approval from 3 separate subcommittees before anyone realized what was happening. And so, on testing day, 12 candidates from various species stood in the designated staging area while Judge Kelrath announced the new protocols with what could only be described as insufferable smugness. This cycle, Kelrath declared, their translation implant rendering their clicks and whistles into smoothly bureaucratic galactic common. We will be implementing enhanced reality survival protocols. All nutrient packs will be confiscated to better simulate actual survival conditions. The staging area erupted into chaos. A Phoenix candidate, whose metabolism required feeding every 6 hours, began hyperventilating into their breathing apparatus. 2 Kalari started arguing in rapid harmonic frequencies about contractual obligations and reasonable expectations. A Vosh simply wilted, their leaves drooping in dismay. "This is outrageous," shouted a Drexel named Cormuth. "The testing parameters specifically state, the parameters have been updated." Kelrath interrupted smoothly. "You all signed waivers acknowledging that testing conditions may vary. Besides, you'll only be out there for 3 standard days. Surely your species survived long enough to develop space travel without eating for 3 days." This logic was of course deeply flawed. Most species had developed space travel precisely because they'd created civilizations where regular eating was guaranteed. The Drexel had invented faster-than-light travel primarily to establish more reliable trade routes for exotic spices. The Kalari had reached for the stars because they'd literally run out of interesting things to do on their homeworld after eliminating all forms of scarcity. But Kelrath was already having the support staff collect the nutrient packs, ignoring the protests with the serene confidence of someone who had never been genuinely hungry in their entire life. Amid the chaos, one candidate seemed remarkably unbothered by this development. The human designation Marcus Webb, according to the roster, simply shrugged and handed over his pack without complaint. He was a relatively standard example of his species' bipedal, forward-facing eyes, wearing what appeared to be comfortable outdoor clothing rather than the technical survival gear most candidates favored. Judge Morvan noticed his lack of concern and made a note in their observation file. Either the human didn't understand the situation, or he knew something the others didn't. Given humanity's recent admission to the galactic community and their baffling approach to basically everything, both options seemed equally likely. "You may now proceed to your designated zones," Kelrath announced, clearly pleased with themselves. "Remember, your emergency beacons will summon immediate extraction if needed. There is no shame in recognizing your limits." The candidates dispersed into the forest with varying degrees of distress. The judges returned to their observation deck, a climate-controlled facility with panoramic views, comfortable seating, and ironically, a fully stocked refreshment area. "This should be interesting," Kelrath said, settling into their chair and pulling up the biometric displays for all 12 candidates. Interesting was certainly one word for it. By the end of the first day, the observation deck had become a command center, managing a slow-motion catastrophe. 9 of the 12 candidates were showing signs of significant stress. The Phoenix had activated their emergency beacon within 4 hours, unable to cope with the hunger pangs. 2 Drexel had formed a coalition and were engaged in an increasingly desperate debate about whether eating tree bark would violate any board regulations. The Vosh had discovered that being essentially a plant did not, in fact, mean they could survive on photosynthesis alone when they were accustomed to regular nutrient supplementation. They were now in a state of extremely slow-motion panic, which for their species meant their leaves were turning a concerning shade of yellow-green. Perhaps this was too ambitious, Judge Tellox observed, watching a Kalari candidate trying to explain to the forest why it should provide sustenance through the power of logical argument. "Nonsense," Kelrath insisted, though they looked less confident than before. This is valuable data about species resilience under adverse conditions. This is valuable data about how our civilizations have become soft, Morven corrected. Look at them. 3 days without eating, and they're acting like it's the end of existence. To be fair, Teluk said, for some of their metabolisms, it might actually be dangerous. They fell silent, watching the displays. Most candidates had settled into a pattern of minimal movement and maximum complaining. The Drexel coalition had expanded to include a Kalari and was now debating the philosophical implications of survival testing. One candidate had built an impressive shelter and was sitting inside it, looking miserable but determined to outlast the test through sheer stubbornness. And then there was the human. Where is candidate Webb? Morven asked suddenly, scanning their displays. The others checked their screens. The human's biometric beacon was active, showing he was approximately 2 kilometers into his designated zone, but the visual feed showed only empty forest. He appears to be mobile, Teluk said, studying the movement patterns. And his vital signs are stable. Remarkably stable, actually. This was unusual. By this point in the test, most candidates were conserving energy, remaining stationary, and waiting for either rescue or the test's conclusion. The human, however, seemed to be actively moving through the forest with purpose. Pull up his tracking history, Kelrath ordered. The display showed Marcus Webb's movements over the past several hours. Rather than staying near his drop point like a sensible candidate, he'd been ranging through the forest in what seemed like random patterns, occasionally stopping for extended periods before moving on. What is he doing? Morven wondered. Maybe humans require more movement to maintain their physiology, Teluk suggested. Some species need regular activity to regulate their systems. Or he's looking for something, Kelrath said slowly. Looking for what? We removed all the food supplies. Perhaps he doesn't understand that this planet is carefully managed. Maybe he thinks there's something out there to find. The judges shared a look that, despite their vastly different biologies, conveyed the same thought. The human didn't understand the test's parameters. He was wasting energy on a futile search when he should be conserving resources. It was almost sad, really. They made additional notes and continued monitoring. As the first day turned to night, most candidates activated their shelter systems and settled in for an uncomfortable rest. The human's beacon showed he'd stopped moving and appeared to be stationary. At least he's finally resting, Teluk said. His energy expenditure today was concerning. What none of the judges noticed, primarily because their sensors weren't configured to detect it, was the thin column of smoke rising from the human's location. Their environmental monitors registered a minor thermal anomaly, but classified it as a small forest fire, possibly caused by natural causes. The satellite systems automatically dispatched a minor amount of fire suppression mist, then logged the incident as resolved. Day 2 began with 3 more candidates activating their emergency beacons. The philosophical debate coalition had dissolved into hungry, irritable individuals who were no longer speaking to each other. The Vosh was now a deeply concerning shade of brown. We should conclude the test early, Morven suggested. This isn't generating useful data anymore. It's just documenting suffering. Give it until the end of today, Kelrath said, though they sounded less certain. Let's see if anyone adapts. The human's biometric readings remained oddly stable. In fact, if anything, they'd improved overnight. His energy levels were normal, his stress markers were low, and his vital signs suggested someone who was well rested and adequately fed. That can't be right, Teluk said, reviewing the data. Check his beacon for malfunctions. The beacon checked out as functioning perfectly. The human was, according to every metric available, doing absolutely fine. "I want a visual on him," Kelrath demanded. The observation team deployed a micro-drone, carefully maneuvering it through the forest canopy toward the human's location. What the drone's camera revealed caused absolute silence in the observation deck. Marcus Webb was sitting beside a small controlled fire. On a flat rock near the flames, something was cooking, actual pieces of meat on improvised skewers. Nearby, several small furry creatures hung from a branch, clearly dead and partially processed. The human was using a knife, apparently part of his personal equipment, that hadn't been confiscated since it wasn't classified as a food supply, to work on what appeared to be plant matter. As the judges watched in stunned silence, the human casually turned his cooking meat, tested it with his finger, and then removed it from the fire. He ate with evident satisfaction, like someone enjoying a pleasant meal, rather than a desperate survivor choking down sustenance. "He's eating," Morven said, their voice flat with disbelief. "I can see that," Kelrath snapped. "Where did he get food?" "We confiscated all the nutrient packs." "He didn't get food," Teluk said slowly, their translator somehow managing to convey their dawning horror. The judges stared at the screen as the human finished his meal, carefully extinguished his fire, and then stood and stretched like someone preparing for a productive day. He picked up what looked like a crude carrying bag, woven from plant fibers, they realized with growing disbelief, and headed back into the forest with the casual confidence of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. "Deploy more drones," Kelrath ordered. "I want continuous observation." Over the next several hours, the judges received a comprehensive education in primitive survival techniques that their civilizations had forgotten millennia ago. They watched as Marcus Webb checked a series of snares he'd apparently constructed the previous day, simple but effective devices that used bent saplings and cordage to capture small animals. 3 had been successful overnight. He processed these catches with efficient, practiced movements, then carefully wrapped the meat in broad leaves before storing it in his improvised bag. He identified and harvested various plants, some of which the planet's xenobotany database confirmed were edible, though it had never occurred to anyone that knowing this would be relevant. The human found a stream, not one of the marked water sources, but an actual natural waterway, and refilled a container made from what appeared to be bark. He'd even created a basic filter using charcoal sand and plant fibers layered in a way that suggested actual engineering knowledge rather than desperate improvisation. By midday, Marcus Webb had established what could only be described as a functional camp. He had food, water, shelter constructed from branches and leaves, and even appeared to be working on improvements to his setup. At one point, he sat by his fire and used a sharp rock to carve something into a piece of wood, apparently passing time while his latest catch cooked. "This is impossible," Kelrath whispered. "The test is designed for candidates to demonstrate their ability to use standard survival equipment until rescue arrives. He's actually surviving, primitively, without any equipment." "Humans come from a Class 7 death world," Telok said quietly, pulling up the file on Earth. "Look at this. Predators everywhere. Extreme weather variations. Poisonous plants and animals. Microbial threats. Geological instability. Their species spent millions of years learning to survive in environments that would kill most of us in hours. But they have technology now," Morven protested. "They have space travel. Surely they've moved beyond this primitive knowledge." "Have they?" Telok continued reading. "Their children are taught these skills. They call it camping and do it recreationally. For fun, they deliberately go into wilderness areas and practice surviving with minimal equipment as a leisure activity. The observation deck fell silent as this information sank in. While other species had spent thousands of years optimizing their civilizations to eliminate any need for primitive survival skills, humans had apparently kept teaching them anyway, just in case. It was simultaneously impressive and deeply disturbing. "What do we do?" Morven asked. "He's clearly not in any distress. His performance exceeds all parameters. But this isn't what we were testing for. We can't fail him," Telox pointed out. "He's demonstrating survival capabilities far beyond any other candidate. The fact that his methods are archaic doesn't change that he's succeeding where everyone else is failing." Kelrath made a frustrated sound. "This is going to create a nightmare for the Standardization Committee. How do we write regulations around someone ignoring all the established protocols and succeeding anyway?" On screen, Marcus Webb was now weaving additional cordage from plant fibers while his meal cooked. He looked, if anything, relaxed, possibly even content. Day 3 arrived with only 4 candidates remaining in the field besides the human. The others had all activated their emergency beacons, unable to continue. Even the stubborn one who'd built the impressive shelter had finally given up, too hungry and miserable to maintain their determination. The remaining candidates were in poor condition. The Philosophical Debate Coalition had reformed out of pure misery, now debating whether the test constituted a violation of sentient rights. The Vosh was barely conscious. The other 2 were simply enduring, counting down the hours until the test concluded. Marcus Webb woke at dawn, checked his snares, prepared breakfast, and seemed to be considering whether to spend his final day improving his camp or exploring more of the area. He eventually decided on exploration, packing some supplies and heading out with the casual energy of someone on a nature hike. His vital signs indicate he could continue this indefinitely, Telox reported. His nutrition levels are stable, hydration is good, and his stress markers are lower than some of our candidates were at the start of the test. That's because he's not treating this as survival, Morven realized. He's treating it as, I don't know, a normal activity. This isn't stressful for him. It should be. Kelrath protested. We removed all his resources. No, Telox corrected quietly. We removed all his equipment. We didn't remove his resources. We just didn't realize he could use the environment itself as a resource because none of our species remembers how to do that anymore. The implications hung heavy in the air. The Galactic Survival Certification Board had spent 17,000 cycles perfecting a test that assumed survival was impossible without technology. They'd created protocols based on the fundamental belief that candidates needed to be rescued because actual self-sufficiency was a relic of primitive times. And then a human had walked onto their carefully controlled test planet and proved that all their assumptions were wrong. When the test concluded at the 72-hour mark, extraction teams collected the remaining candidates. Most emerged hungry, exhausted and traumatized by the experience. 3 required immediate medical attention due to the metabolic stress of extended fasting. Marcus Webb emerged from the forest carrying his improvised bag, looking refreshed and healthy. He'd even brought some of his remaining food supplies with him, apparently unsure if he'd be fed immediately upon extraction. The judges met him at the debrief station, still trying to process what they'd witnessed. Candidate Webb, Kelrath began. Your performance was irregular. Marcus raised an eyebrow. Did I do something wrong? Wrong? No, not wrong. Just unexpected. We observed you procuring food from the environment, creating fire without technological assistance, constructing traps and tools. These aren't techniques covered in any of our preparatory materials. Marcus looked genuinely confused. You took away all our food supplies. What did you expect us to do? Wait for the test to conclude, Morven said. That's what the test was designed to measure. Your ability to maintain yourself with limited resources until extraction. But there were resources everywhere, Marcus protested. The forest was full of game, edible plants, water sources. It would have been harder not to find food. The judges exchanged glances. This perspective was so alien to them that they struggled to formulate a response. Most species, Telox explained carefully, don't retain knowledge of primitive survival techniques. Our civilizations eliminated the need for such skills long ago. Oh, Marcus processed this. That seems kind of risky, doesn't it? I mean, what if your technology fails? That's what emergency beacons are for, Kelrath said. And what if those fail? Silence. The question had literally never occurred to any of them. Well, Kelrath finally said, you've certainly passed the certification requirements. Exceeded them, actually. Congratulations. Marcus smiled. That was actually pretty fun. Haven't been camping in a while. Really took me back to summer trips with my dad. Fun, Morven repeated weakly. You found this fun? Sure. Nice weather, decent hunting, no work emails. Could have used better fishing opportunities, but you can't have everything. After Marcus left, the judges sat in stunned contemplation of what they'd just witnessed. We need to update our protocols, Telox said finally. Update them how? Kelrath demanded. Add a section on primitive survival techniques. Our candidates don't know how to do any of that. Neither do we. We'd have to completely redesign the certification standards to account for candidates who can actually survive without technology. Maybe that's not a bad thing, Morven suggested quietly. Maybe we've been testing the wrong skills. We've been so focused on teaching people to wait for rescue that we've forgotten survival used to mean something else entirely. You're suggesting we teach everyone to set snares and cook over fires. Kelrath's translator somehow conveyed their skepticism. I'm suggesting, Morven said, that maybe the humans have retained something important that the rest of us lost. The ability to actually survive, not just endure until someone saves us. Kelrath slumped in their chair. The Standardization Committee is going to hate this. They did in fact hate it. The incident sparked heated debates across the Galactic Survival Certification Board about the nature of survival certification, the purpose of testing, and whether primitive skills should be considered valid in an advanced technological society. Subcommittees formed. Reports were written. Regulations were proposed and counter-proposed. In the end, the board implemented a new rule. Candidates who demonstrated primitive survival techniques would be required to submit detailed documentation of their methods for safety review. This documentation would be evaluated by a newly formed committee on traditional survival methodologies, which would determine if the techniques met acceptable standards. It was a bureaucratic solution to a philosophical problem, which was very on-brand for the GSCB. Meanwhile, Marcus Webb's certification was quietly flagged with a special notation indicating non-standard methodology, approved pending review. He never found out about any of the chaos he'd caused. He was too busy enjoying his new job on a frontier station, where his camping skills occasionally proved useful when equipment malfunctioned. And somewhere in the GSCB archives, buried in thousands of pages of regulatory updates and committee findings, a small notation appeared in the official history of the Primitive World Survival Certification Test, year 17423. First candidate to pass without using any provided equipment, species human. Result: all previous testing assumptions questioned, regulations updated, morale significantly impacted. The galactic community had conquered the stars, eliminated scarcity, and created civilizations of unprecedented comfort and security. They had achieved technological marvels that would have seemed like magic to their ancestors. And then they met a species that had done all of that, while still remembering how to start a fire and set a snare, just in case. Turned out, some primitive skills weren't so primitive after all.